In the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, three big families have held prominence for over 1,000 years. These three families are the Gojo, Kamo, and Zenin clan. With these three clans come a number of hereditary curse techniques, some that you probably already know. And in today's video, let's explain everything so you get a deeper understanding. What's up guys, Restless Gambler here, and in today's video, I decided to do something quite different. Initially, I was supposed to make like an hour-long video explaining all three curse techniques from the families at once, but I decided to divide it in three. Today, I'll explain the Gojo family curse technique, and soon I'll do the Kamo and Zenin clan. I don't actually know how long this video is going to be, but no matter what, I assure you this will be of quality. With that said, last night I woke up in a cold sweat because YouTube told me only 17% of you are subscribed.
Oh, damn! I'm sorry.
If you enjoy JJK videos like these, go ahead and subscribe. You get more videos and we'll both be happy. As established previously, we'll be going into the Gojo family first. So far in the series, we've gotten to know a grand total of 1.5 Gojo clan members, those being Gojo Satoru and Yuta Akotsu. Yuta is the half Gojo clan member because in reality, he's a super distant cousin of Gojo, being a descendant of Michizane. With the Gojo clan comes two different hereditary traits. 1. The limitless curse technique, and 2. The six eyes. Before we actually go into explaining the technique, I first have to make one thing known. There isn't a direct statement that the six eyes is a Gojo clan exclusive trait. I've seen two different translations of the JJK fan book where they talk about the six eyes, and both don't directly say it's passed down only for the Gojo clan. On the flip side of things, we know that the six eyes user before Satoru Gojo was a limitless user as well, so just take all of that with a grain of salt. But now, let's begin. The limitless. We've seen only one character use this curse technique, and that's obviously Kenji Hikari. At the base level, limitless is the ability to make impossible concepts possible. In JJK 0, Miguel says Gojo manipulates space at an atomic level. In the JJK 0 movie, he says Gojo manipulates time-space itself. The force field that surrounds Gojo is named Infinity, and this name isn't an exaggeration. That is, in some cases. There are a ton, and I mean a ton of different theories for what exactly this force field is, but I'll only go over one explanation in full, then dumb it down afterwards. In the Gojo vs Jogo fight, we see two things that show nuance to the technique. When Gojo closes his finger a little more here, he says, "What you touched was the infinity between us." He essentially showcases that he can make an, in quotations, infinity in a finite distance. Now, what does that mean? Let's look at when Gojo invites Jogo to touch the infinity. Jogo describes it as his hand stopping just before touching him and never reaching him. This is the infinity between them. What's actually happening here is a paradox we know as Zeno's paradox. To keep it short and sweet, imagine Hikari has to walk from home to Jujutsu Tech. To get there, Hikari has to walk to the half point between where he started and the school. Then from there, he has to walk from that half point to the half point from there and the school. And then he has to do that infinitely. What this paradox implies is that it would take Hikari an infinite amount of time to get from where he started to Jujutsu Tech, essentially implying movement is impossible as a whole. But clearly that's not the case because we do move, right? Well, Gojo takes that paradox and makes it a reality. Apply the same thing that Hikari had to do to get to school to Jogo's hand trying to reach Gojo's hand. Jogo's hand has to move in halves infinitely, so it will never actually reach Gojo. And that's how Gojo's base infinity works with that explanation. Anything Gojo doesn't allow to touch him will slow down infinitely and will never actually touch him. Before his awakening against Toji, Gojo had to manually turn on infinity to avoid damage, but after his awakening, since he has full access to reverse curse technique, he has it on 24/7 and turns it off on occasion. His infinity gauges the danger of things coming at him and it stops it. It's also implied that poisons can be stopped as well, but that's up to interpretation. With that in mind, and the fact that it's implied that Gojo can manipulate space, this is what allows Gojo to, in quotations, fly or float. There isn't an actual explanation in the manga, but what I think Gojo is doing is manipulating space to allow him to float around where he pleases. You could even argue Gojo is manipulating gravity so he can break physics and float, but just know it's because of his curse technique that Gojo can fly. There's also another thing Gojo does with his Limitless, and that's his ability to teleport. With the explanation that Gojo can manipulate space, it's much easier to understand. If Gojo can make it so that it takes you an infinite amount of time to reach him, he can do the opposite and make it so that it takes 0 time to reach a finite distance. In chapter 226, it's explained to us that Gojo's teleportation is just an application of his Limitless to compress the space between him and the place he wants to go to. I would think of it as Gojo making the distance between his target and where he is now 0, then it resetting back to normal in an instant, and Gojo is just officially where he wanted to be then after. Super complex and also a super headcanon. The only explanation we've gotten for it is that he can only use it under certain circumstances. When he uses it in the Goodwill event, we see him do a hand sign, and this is important because, well, one, he needs to make a hand sign before doing this technique, but also it kind of reflects what he's doing. So think of it like Gojo folding the distance between him and his target together just like his hands are doing, and then boom, he teleports. It's like if you have glue on one end of a paper, then fold the paper so that the glue touches the other side of the paper, then you unfold it and the glue is on the other side. Teleportation. He can also use this on other people, but they have to stand inside of some sort of seal. Beyond that, we know that Gojo has 3 different techniques he has because of this infinity, and so we'll start with blue. Remember that Gojo's infinity is derived from the fact that Gojo can manipulate space, as Miguel said. Blue is essentially Gojo amplifying the concept of dividing infinitely and creating an unknown. Let's break it down. So we already established that Gojo's infinity is basically an infinite distance because the concept he brings into reality is that the distance halves infinitely, right? Now, here was Gege's mindset when writing this. He believed that the infinite series in Zeno's paradox has no end, as anyone will believe because it's infinite. But when Gege decided to implement it into a series, he gave it a little twist, where eventually the infinite addition of numbers would create a 0, and that 0 would eventually get divided as part of the infinite series. The result of that division is clearly unknown because dividing a 0 is an impossibility. Gege later has Gojo call it something like -1 apples. Let me make it more clear. Remember that Hikari scenario? Let's put it to use and expand it. Let's say the distance from Hikari's home and Jujutsu Tech is 2 miles. That means the first half he has to walk to in an infinite series is 1 mile, then the second half is 1/2 of a mile, and so on and so forth. But now imagine that goes on for so long that he eventually creates a 0. This is crazy because now the 0 is part of the series and the series divides infinitely, remember? So that 0 gets divided and that creates an unknown. This unknown is a spawn point of what we know now as blue. Earlier I said the unknown is clearly an unknown because dividing 0 is an impossibility. Well, what do you think would happen to reality if an impossibility is forced upon it? It would try to revert itself. And so when Gojo creates the 0 manually because he's amplifying it, the 0 gets divided and an impossibility is formed wherever Gojo lets it. And that's how the magnetic effect happens, because the universe, reality itself, is trying to fix what Gojo created. This is shown to us firsthand when Gojo goes against a guy with the clone technique. With one use of blue, 2 of them fly into each other. Gojo describes it as him manifesting impossible situations like -1 apples, and because of it, he creates a magnetic effect. So to put it simply, Gojo creates the impossible and space tries to revert it, essentially creating a suck in motion like he does when he uses blue. This can be used as a projectile like he does against Agito, or it can be used to throw opponents like he does against Toji. He can also make it max output to make a larger area of impact. Gojo, after his awakening, is now able to make multiple spawn points at once that distort the limbs of his target or can completely crush them. Also, now Gojo can keep the blue active even after it crushes something we'll go into in a second. But my favorite use of it is when he uses it on his punches. In chapter 231, Kusakabe asks who's been seriously punched by Gojo before, and Hikari and Yuta say that they have. Hikari describes it as being hit with a counterattack while you're bracing for a regular one. This is crazy to me because it's like, for example, if we're boxing, right? You see me throw a punch and you tense up to take a hit, but then the hit you actually take feels like a punch you take after missing your own attack and getting hit without guard. I literally cannot imagine how hard that is, but Sukuna took that, plus a red pushing towards him and a black flash amping the attack by the power of 2.5. Yeah, that's by far one of the strongest punches in the entire series. Speaking of red, that's the least explored technique, but you can clearly gauge what's going on. It's the reverse of blue, so instead of attracting, it rejects. We're not actually told how it works or anything of the sort, but one thing we do know is that Gojo creates an empty space that explodes and pushes the target back. With this in mind, maybe we can come up with some theories. Earlier we said that blue comes from dividing a 0, but what if here he actually multiplies it by itself and creates another 0, and that 0 becomes the empty space that Gojo is talking about. And so because of that, space and reality, again just like blue, is trying to revert back and creates a pushing effect instead of a pulling effect. Gojo can choose when exactly the red explodes and where it explodes because of his mastery of it. Before his awakening, he couldn't even use it, so I think we can chalk it up to his current proficiency. Now with that in mind, these two phenomenon are impossibilities. So what would happen if we put these two together? One that pulls things in and one that pushes things away. But because space is trying to fix back to its originality, red and blue, mix it together and you get purple. When Gojo decides to add these two impossibilities, he creates an imaginary mass that pushes forward. This imaginary mass deletes things from existence, at least in terms of what was in the space to begin with. For example, during the Gojo arc, when he uses it for the first time, it deletes everything in his path, including Hanami's arm. Of course, Hanami grows it back, but in that moment, the space she existed in was deleted. This explanation kind of reminds me of Sukuna's world cutting dismantle, and that's why I take it with a grain of salt. Because while I would subscribe to the idea of existence erasure, we've seen things not be erased, rather destroyed by purple. So in regards to that, it really is up to interpretation. Something I also found interesting is that this technique is kind of comparable and similar to Yorozu's perfect spear. When she creates hers, it's described as an impossibility as well, and so anything it comes into contact with is crushed by its infinite pressure. With the limitless technique itself out of the way, I think it's time to get into one of my more favorite things about this technique, the domain expansion. Gojo's domain expansion that comes as an application of the limitless technique is named Infinite Void, or Unlimited Void. I like Unlimited Void better, I can't lie. But anyways, when Gojo opens his domain expansion, you're hit with infinite amounts of information. I'll explain what that means in a second, but upon taking in all this information, you remain in a suspended state as your brain tries and fails to process all the information being sent to you. Sorcerers and cursed spirits are implied to be the ones who can actually survive this full throttle. In Shibuya, Gojo uses it but for 0.2 seconds, and the three cursed spirits, Jogo, Mahito, and Choso, woke up way before any of the non-sorcerers around them. Jogo also took in the domain expansion before and survived, same with Sukuna. However, it still fries your brain as Sukuna wasn't able to use his domain expansion after being exposed to it for less than 10 seconds. There's also contradictions to this rule, I guess, as Megumi is still able to communicate clearly even though he got hit with the domain expansion 5 times in a row. Now, what is it that the domain expansion actually does to you? Well, it's kinda crazy. Essentially, in it, you can perceive everything in the entire universe. This isn't specifically stated, but it's implied as Jogo says he can see and feel everything. It being everything from the entire universe doesn't matter because on top of perceiving all of these things, the target has to process them infinitely. At the end of chapter 15, Gege goes a little in depth with that idea. If you take what he can see as an example, so in this instance, an apple, a gorilla, and a trumpet, instead of Jogo having to process them individually, Jogo has to process the apple's first letter infinitely. So instead of just saying apple in his mind, blood is stuck on the A. And so that freezes you because your mind can't even process everything you're perceiving, let alone do anything. Like I said earlier, Gojo can use a 0.2 second domain variant, and he also has 2 other variants beyond that. First is one where he reverses the hardness of his outer shell with the inner shell, making the outside super hard. He uses this to counteract Sukuna slashing and destroying his domain from the outside. And the second variant that he uses is a super small domain that reinforces the outside to its greatest capacity. Gojo is able to do this because of his experience inside of the prison realm. With that said, we've explained the Gojo family's curse technique, the Limitless. We've gone over the Infinity, Red, Blue, Purple, and his domain expansion. But now, let's talk about the thing that allows Gojo to even use this curse technique in the first place. The 6 Eyes. We already established that the 6 Eyes is probably most likely a Gojo family thing. Whether or not that's the case doesn't really matter because this thing is so rare, no 2 6 Eyes users can exist at the same time. And that's good because these eyes are broken as fuck. When we first see Gojo, the first thing we notice is that he always wears a blindfold. Heck, when he was a teenager, he always wore the glasses that blind people wear. Under normal circumstances, glasses that dark and a blindfold should completely block you off from sight, but Gojo's 6 Eyes are the reason he has to partake in wearing these accessories. With the 6 Eyes, Gojo can see curse energy in extreme detail, so even with the blindfold on, Gojo can still see curse energy as if he were using a high-resolution thermography. The reason he resorts to always wearing blindfolds is because despite Gojo's brain always being fresh, Gojo's 6 Eyes tire him when they're exposed completely, so he covers them. Seeing curse energy isn't the only thing, however, because along with curse energy, he can see the residue or flow of curse energy in buildings, even considering that they don't have curse energy themselves. He can also look at you and gauge your strength as he did with Yuji in chapter 52. Gojo with the 6 Eyes can also gauge your curse technique to a certain extent. Just like most of the other things I've talked about so far, this isn't specifically explained to us, but we've seen Gojo use it twice. Well, actually once, but you'll understand what I mean. In chapter 69, Gojo fights the paper bad guy who has a cloning technique. He then completely dissects the entire technique and says that the reason he knows it is because he has good eyes. The thing is, this led people to believe Gojo can see you and understand your entire curse technique, but that just isn't the case. In chapter 53, it's stated that Gojo swooping in and taking the kill isn't actually what it looks like. It's just that Gojo didn't know the exact specifics of Todo's curse technique, and so his observation that Todo and Yuji are far from Hanami was a miscommunication, leading to the Hollow Purple that could have deleted any of them. Gojo, Sukuna, and maybe Yuta are the only 3 people who can cast a domain multiple times in one day under normal circumstances. I said maybe Yuta because Yuta has the second biggest curse energy pool from what we know, but Gojo and Sukuna can do it because of their curse energy efficiency. Sukuna just has the skill naturally, but Gojo has the 6 Eyes that puts him in a tier above everyone else when it comes to expending curse energy. Mind you, Gojo has been using reverse curse technique and infinity for around 10 years straight. It's explained to us what exactly Gojo does. In chapter 140, Yuta throws a car at Yuji and Yuji realizes that he reinforces his body with insane amounts of curse energy. Yuta says that he has more than Gojo, but the difference is Gojo has the 6 Eyes, so the curse energy he loses when he activates a curse technique is the word is infinitesimally. That's a crazy word. Let's restart. Gojo has the 6 Eyes, so the curse energy he loses when he activates a curse technique is infinite. It's really close to 0. This is how Gojo can just use infinity in RCT, which we've seen deplete Yuta's curse energy for years without worry. After all, Gojo cannot run out of curse energy. Imagine it like this. We know there's an ambiguous amount of time you need to recharge curse energy. Gojo would use a technique, say a domain expansion, the one shown to take up the most curse energy, and that would cost him an immeasurably small amount of curse energy because his curse energy efficiency is so insane. And then after, he recovered that curse energy instantly because the cost was so low. Gojo truly cannot run out of curse energy. Another thing we see Gojo be able to do with his 6 Eyes, or at least it's implied to be because of it, is seeing and distinguishing different souls. In chapter 229, Gojo hits Sukuna with Unlimited Void and goes in to finish him. As he does this, however, Sukuna swaps places with Mahoraga out of nowhere. Gojo, seeing this, prompts himself to one-shot Mahoraga, but Mahoraga just breaks the domain and Gojo realizes that somehow Mahoraga had already adapted to Unlimited Void. In the next chapter, Gojo is confused as hell. He asks if Mahoraga adapted in 0.01 seconds or if Sukuna took the burden of adaptation. Then we see the perspective of Gojo looking at Sukuna and we see two sparks. The one who took the burden of adapting to Unlimited Void was Megumi's soul. I think it's heavily implied that this is Gojo blatantly looking at the soul, and that just makes Gojo's Six Eyes all the more insane. The final thing the Six Eyes grants Gojo is something I didn't really think much of before, but the latest chapter of JJK 256 as of this recording, I think really doubled down on it. That ability is a fast perception of time. In chapter 90, it's told to us that the condition for the prison realm to work is for someone to stand within a 4-meter radius of it for 1 minute. Jogo gets mad at Kenjaku for giving them such an impossible task, but Kenjaku reassures him, saying it just has to be 1 minute in his mind. This made no sense because a minute should be a minute, but clearly something is different for Gojo. This is why as soon as Kenjaku appears to distract Gojo, a minute passes so quickly in his mind. In the latest chapter of JJK, Gojo explains to us why he cannot use Black Flash.
That's devastating.
In the latest chapter of JJK, Gojo explains to us why he can't use Black Flash at will. He says that it depends on a lot of circumstances and that the description of applying curse energy 1 microsecond after a hit is a bad one. After all, if that's all it took, Gojo could easily use it at will. I think this is a clear implication that somehow the Six Eyes allows Gojo to perceive time at a faster rate than everyone else. So hypothetically, if Gojo were to get hit with projection sorcery, he'd be able to go by the rules with ease. Definitely an ability of the strongest sorcerer. And so with all that said, I've explained Gojo's abilities to the greatest of my capabilities. Infinity is Gojo making Zeno's paradox a reality and wrapping himself with it. Blue is Gojo amplifying his infinity to make a 0 and dividing that by 0, creating an impossibility that pulls things in. Red is the opposite, where Gojo most likely multiplies 2 zeros to create an empty space that pushes things away. Purple is the combination of those two impossibilities to delete anything in his path. Unlimited Void, his domain expansion, fries your brain and freezes you by putting infinite amounts of information into your brain. And his Six Eyes gives him the ability to see curse energy, gauge your curse technique, and have the best curse energy efficiency in the entire verse. What did you guys think? Did I forget something? Let me know down in the comments. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and subscribe. And I'll catch y'all in the next one.